talking Robo Warriors. This is a 1996 movie directed by Ian Barry. It stars James Remar as Gibson and James Liu as our kind of antagonist alien character. Now the story of this one actually kind of goes back to the late 80s with the Stuart Gordon directed movie Robot JOX. This was a a movie which I guess you could say somewhat inspired Pacific Rim all these years later, and was for the time one of the most expensive movies that the production company ever made. Now this was a movie that was beset with problems. Producers had different ideas about the tone of the movie, cast members weren't getting on due to political kind of differences and things like this, and was a little bit of a troubled production, you might say. It did find somewhat of a cult following when it eventually came out on VHS in the late 80s, 1989. And it did have an intended sequel where the two kind of rivals from the original movie would team up to fight an alien kind of menace. Now, this never actually happened, and we said we kind of got loose follow-ups, which weren't actually sequels, but kind of similar looking movies in some ways, which had concepts. First up we had Crash and Burn in 1990, and then Robot Wars in 1993. In 1996 we actually got Robo Warriors, which although isn't directly kind of tied to the original Robot JOX movie, it is certainly the most similar, and arguably you could say this was set in the same universe, and it actually does take elements from the proposed sequel that was never shot for Robot JOX, that being that there was an alien invasion movie. Okay, so with that all said and done, let's talk about the plot of this movie. So this takes place at some point in the future, and there has been an alien invasion which has occupied the Earth. Now, comparisons can be made to kind of things like Nazi Germany, and we've seen stuff like that with kind of TV shows like V, for example. In this particular context of the movie, they have taken over the planet, and there was a kind of a big war which was primarily fought with large robots, a la Robo JOX, and all the Earth robots have been defeated, with the last kind of pilot of one of these robots being James Remar's character Gibson, who is essentially now in hiding. And it takes the son of a fallen resistance fighter to coax James Remar's Gibson out of retirement and fix the last kind of remaining Earth robot to take on the aliens robots and hopefully fight for survival. What'll happen? You'll have to watch the movie to find out. So does that sound exciting to you? Yes, this is a low budget mid-90s movie, and it has all the trappings of one that you would probably expect. But what can we say that I think works in this movie? Out of the four movies that are loosely connected, I guess you want to say, this to me is the most has the most scope in regards to, I think, kind of story elements here. You know, the backdrop of these kind of alien invading forces and things like this, and of course we have all the kind of the various kind of aliens and things as well, and ground troops and stuff. So this one had a little bit more kind of going on, I would say, than maybe the kind of the previous movies. And you've also got, I would argue, a more of a recognisable start here in James Remar, of course, known primarily, I would say, these days for his role in Dexter, but also the classic movie The Warriors as well. And I actually got to say, I quite like James Remar in this role. I've always quite enjoyed his acting. I always thought he gives a kind of a understated and grounded kind of but somewhat kind of antagonistic flavour to his kind of characters, and it's true of this one. But I quite liked him. I've got to say, I think the acting for some of the cast here is fairly good, and even our kind of young John Connor-like kind of child who he kind of takes under his wing is kind of somewhat kind of a likeable character, and somehow avoids being one of these annoying kind of kid characters that you get in a lot of these kind of style of films. As I said, there's actually a couple of different fights here. I will say I actually preferred the first robot fight, to be honest with you, rather than the finale, if I'm being completely honest. It was shorter, but I have to say I thought it just looked a little bit better against this kind of jungle backdrop, with this kind of almost like a Godzilla looking monster. I thought actually was a little bit more cinematic, if you want my honest opinion. But nonetheless, it was still kind of fun to watch. And we do have kind of this backstory of this kind of occupying alien force and this kind of... But there's lots of things here, and we're going to come on to it and maybe what doesn't work. That, it's set on this interesting backdrop. We have this occupying force, but they seem to be very much, adhering to certain rules, for example. And there seems to be like another alien council, which kind of is ultimately the kind of the determines whether they are allowed to kind of occupy and things like this. So there's a few things that are introduced here that I feel, are interesting concepts, but they're never, not a lot is done with them. Again, we'll kind of come on to a little bit more about that. But there are some interesting concepts here. There are a couple of kind of fun kind of action sequences. I quite like the kind of the music in this movie, and it's surprisingly you'll see scenes here that I think are larger in scale than you might perhaps expect from a film like this. So, for example, lots of different extras, military kind of vehicles, things like this. Different kind of costumes. I was, watching this again. I'd seen it back in the VHS days, but watching it again, I was like, man, this is a little bit larger in scale than I was kind of initially kind of, expecting and kind of had remembered from the, the original days when I kind of watched this. And I have to say, some of the effects, although, they're lower budget, they're kind of like cheaper effects, I still enjoyed them. I still kind of thought they were kind of quite fun. And, watching all these kind of like these giant robots fight each other with various different weapons, it's a fun experience. And as I say, I preferred the first fight, to be honest, but nonetheless, the second fight was still, somewhat enjoyable. But let's talk about maybe what doesn't work. Okay, so as I've mentioned, there are two main kind of robot fights here. And the second one, to me, wasn't as exciting as the first. This is partly, I think, for the reason that it's kind of, in this particular fight, it seems to be in the night, so you can't really see as much. The background isn't as interesting, because the first one's kind of in this jungle setting, this one's in a kind of like an arena, and these ones tend to kind of like just stand, I don't know, they just stand and shoot each other a little bit more, whilst the other one, the first one, they seem to be a little bit more kind of close combat. It just is a little bit drawn out, and I don't think the design of the bad guys robot was as interesting as the first bad guys robot that we see kind of in the midway mark in the movie. And it just goes on a little bit too long, I think, at times as well. So that particular was a little bit disappointing, but I would still say it's still kind of fun to watch. I think maybe one of the problems with this movie is that there's real no context about these kind of alien bad guys. They're just there. They don't really know. We don't really know why they've invaded Earth, what their intentions are, how it is that there is this kind of like uneasy kind of like peace at the point where this movie takes place, where the aliens kind of seem to kind of let the humans go about their business for the most part and are just kind of there. And also why they really kind of accept the fact that they've invaded Earth, and then they lose this kind of, spoiler alert, they lose the kind of the battle at the end of the movie, and then just go, okay, we've agreed to go. Why would you do that? I mean, and then who are these other kind of aliens that seem to kind of try and enforce this decision? There's lots of things here that are just like not mentioned. Some of the dialogue, it's cheesy. You're going to kind of expect this from this kind of movie. And, some of the kind of the costuming, like the aliens and stuff, look a little bit silly. And there was kind of like silly kind of like pew-pew laser effects and things like this. I feel some of the sequences, which are just more characters kind of running around, get a little bit repetitive at times as well. Obviously, the effects work is the most expensive stuff to shoot here, and thus we only get really kind of the two kind of fight sequences, which, to be fair, is probably one more than a lot of these films have. But there's a lot of kind of sequences between that don't feel quite as kind of like as interesting, and the kind of the combat sequences feel a little bit kind of flat ultimately when it's just kind of like people with sci-fi suits on, kind of running around and things like this. And yet, some of the acting from some of the other cast is typical kind of 90s, straight to kind of VOD stuff. But I will say, I actually do think this movie is probably one of the better kind of like lower budget, straight to kind of VHS movies at the time of the kind of the 90s. And I would argue possibly even the best in this series. I just think it has the most going on. And the kind of the designs are the most varied and things like this. I think Robot JOX is probably still considered by most to be the kind of the best out of this series. But I have to say, I think this one is probably better, if not equal, to that film in some ways. I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10. I think this is an above average, VHS mid-90s sci-fi B-movie. I quite kind of enjoyed it, I have to say. Have you seen any of these films from this series? Robot JOX, Crash and Burn, Robot Wars, and then this Robo Warriors, which I feel is the one that people maybe haven't seen because it came out a little bit later than the other ones. So 6 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.